When my upstairs neighbor threatened me with a $1,200 defamation claim over a wall of blurry photos, I realized the gossip in our building had finally found a price tag. It started as whispers about my new privacy fence feeling menacing, then morphed into anonymous notes and covert pictures snapped from the shadows. I did not know yet if our anonymous photo wall would survive that threat letter, but I knew something deeper was on the line: who actually controlled the story of our home. I live in a gated enclave that prides itself on being peaceful and refined. From the outside, it looks like a glossy brochure for suburban calm, with palm trees lining the drive and a stone monument announcing the community name in neat bronze lettering. The evenings are quiet enough that you can hear the sprinklers hiss against the grass, and the metal gate rattles softly whenever a car rolls in late at night. Under that calm surface, though, the place runs on one main fuel: gossip disguised as concern. The homeowners association here loves the word harmony. It is on the welcome packet, in the annual letters, and even in the email footer when they send digital copies of violation notices. The problem is that harmony often means conformity with whoever has the loudest opinion, and that opinion usually comes from above me, my upstairs neighbor, a woman I will call Ms. D. She is the kind of person who notices everything, then pretends she noticed nothing. When I moved in, I was excited about one simple thing: the small concrete patio attached to my unit. It backed up to a narrow walkway and a line of shrubs, with the parking lot just beyond. The first time I stepped out there at dusk, the air smelled like warm asphalt and cut grass, and I pictured a privacy fence with string lights draped along the top, a tiny sanctuary where I could unwind without feeling like I was on display. That fence became the center of this entire HOA revenge story before a single post was even set. The Community Guidelines Handbook waited in my welcome folder, thick and self-important. At the center, in small, dense print, sat CCR Section 7.2 titled Privacy Structures. It allowed fencing up to a certain height, with neutral colors, as long as the board approved the design. I read it twice, made notes, and even printed that specific page. I wanted to do everything by the book, not because I feared the board, but because I understood how people like Ms. D treated any gray area as an invitation to meddle. I submitted my fence request with a tidy sketch, color sample, and a copy of CCR 7.2 attached. The committee took 2 weeks to respond with an approval that was technically conditional. They wanted the fence to match existing structures, no lattice, no bright accents, and the posts had to sit inside the property boundaries by a few inches. That was fine with me. My goal was privacy, not a statement. I signed the approval form, filed it with my other papers, and booked the contractor. The day the fence went up, the sky was a flat, cloudless blue, and the sound of drilling echoed off the stucco walls like it was someone pounding on a drum. I saw blinds twitch on the upper units. A balcony door slid open somewhere above, and I could feel eyes on the workers measuring, leveling, and fastening each panel in place. The fence was a soft gray, clean and smooth, tall enough to block most sightlines from the walkway but still within the approved dimensions. It made the patio feel like a room, not a stage. The first sign of trouble did not come from the board. It came from the stairwell. A folded piece of paper sat on the floor just outside my door when I came home that night. No name, no return address, just sharp handwriting accusing the new fence of feeling hostile and unfriendly. It suggested that it made the walkway feel closed in and that it might scare potential buyers who liked an open, neighborly feel. In that moment, the air in the hallway felt colder than it had outside, even though the old fluorescent light hummed with its usual faint buzz. The note ended with a suggestion that nice communities did not need walls between neighbors. I read it twice, then set it beside my printed copy of CCR 7.2. The rulebook allowed my fence. The anonymous neighbor preferred openness, but only, it seemed, when the openness belonged to my patio and not their balcony. I realized my fence was not just wood and screws, it was a boundary they could not casually cross with their eyes anymore. That was the real problem. I could have thrown the note away. Instead, I slid it into a clear plastic sleeve and dropped it into a thin file folder I labeled with the name of the association. It felt ridiculous in that moment, like I was filing evidence for a trial that would never happen, but something told me this community did not let petty grievances die. It archived them in whispers until someone like Ms. D found a way to make them official. Life in the building moved with a strange rhythm. Morning dog walkers shared updates about other residents by describing their pets. Evening joggers slowed near the bulletin board to skim new postings, then carried those snippets back to their units like they were trading cards. The board met once a month in the small community room near the pool, and on those nights, the scent of chlorine drifted through the open door while the same handful of people decided what everyone else's home should look like. The board president, a sharp-eyed man I will call Mr. K, loved numbers and policies. The treasurer, Lena, seemed to care more about keeping the budget afloat than enforcing taste. The real force, though, was the unofficial seat at the table, the voice of whichever neighbor had complained most recently. That is where Ms. D always found her way in, even if her name never appeared on the official agenda. I learned early on that the association thrived on certain phrases: property values, visual cohesion, safety concerns. You could dress almost any personal preference in one of those outfits and it suddenly looked respectable. If you did not like a neighbor's car, you called it an eyesore impacting property values. If you were afraid of unfamiliar faces, you framed it as a safety concern. If something simply annoyed you, you warned it threatened visual cohesion. The board listened closely whenever someone used those magic words. My fence did not break any rule, but it upset a pattern. Before I moved in, that corner of the property had been bare. The walkway beside my patio was a perfect view corridor for anyone walking by to glance straight into my sliding glass door. People got used to scanning it, the way you might get used to checking a store window as you pass. The fence turned that window into a wall, and that wall turned mindless observing into an effort. Some people hate being reminded that their curiosity has a limit. When my upstairs neighbor threatened me with a $1,200 defamation claim over a wall of blurry photos, I realized the gossip in our building had finally found a price tag. It started as whispers about my new privacy fence feeling menacing, then morphed into anonymous notes and covert pictures snapped from the shadows. I did not know yet if our anonymous photo wall would survive that threat letter, but I knew something deeper was on the line: who actually controlled the story of our home. I live in a gated enclave that prides itself on being peaceful and refined. From the outside, it looks like a glossy brochure for suburban calm, with palm trees lining the drive and a stone monument announcing the community name in neat bronze lettering. The evenings are quiet enough that you can hear the sprinklers hiss against the grass, and the metal gate rattles softly whenever a car rolls in late at night. Under that calm surface, though, the place runs on one main fuel: gossip disguised as concern. The homeowners association here loves the word harmony. It is on the welcome packet, in the annual letters, and even in the email footer when they send digital copies of violation notices. The problem is that harmony often means conformity with whoever has the loudest opinion, and that opinion usually comes from above me, my upstairs neighbor, a woman I will call Ms. D. She is the kind of person who notices everything, then pretends she noticed nothing. When I moved in, I was excited about one simple thing: the small concrete patio attached to my unit. It backed up to a narrow walkway and a line of shrubs, with the parking lot just beyond. The first time I stepped out there at dusk, the air smelled like warm asphalt and cut grass, and I pictured a privacy fence with string lights draped along the top, a tiny sanctuary where I could unwind without feeling like I was on display. That fence became the center of this entire HOA revenge story before a single post was even set. The Community Guidelines Handbook waited in my welcome folder, thick and self-important. At the center, in small, dense print, sat CCR Section 7.2 titled Privacy Structures. It allowed fencing up to a certain height, with neutral colors, as long as the board approved the design. I read it twice, made notes, and even printed that specific page. I wanted to do everything by the book, not because I feared the board, but because I understood how people like Ms. D treated any gray area as an invitation to meddle. I submitted my fence request with a tidy sketch, color sample, and a copy of CCR 7.2 attached. The committee took 2 weeks to respond with an approval that was technically conditional. They wanted the fence to match existing structures, no lattice, no bright accents, and the posts had to sit inside the property boundaries by a few inches. That was fine with me. My goal was privacy, not a statement. I signed the approval form, filed it with my other papers, and booked the contractor. The day the fence went up, the sky was a flat, cloudless blue, and the sound of drilling echoed off the stucco walls like it was someone pounding on a drum. I saw blinds twitch on the upper units. A balcony door slid open somewhere above, and I could feel eyes on the workers measuring, leveling, and fastening each panel in place. The fence was a soft gray, clean and smooth, tall enough to block most sightlines from the walkway but still within the approved dimensions. It made the patio feel like a room, not a stage. The first sign of trouble did not come from the board. It came from the stairwell. A folded piece of paper sat on the floor just outside my door when I came home that night. No name, no return address, just sharp handwriting accusing the new fence of feeling hostile and unfriendly. It suggested that it made the walkway feel closed in and that it might scare potential buyers who liked an open, neighborly feel. In that moment, the air in the hallway felt colder than it had outside, even though the old fluorescent light hummed with its usual faint buzz. The note ended with a suggestion that nice communities did not need walls between neighbors. I read it twice, then set it beside my printed copy of CCR 7.2. The rulebook allowed my fence. The anonymous neighbor preferred openness, but only, it seemed, when the openness belonged to my patio and not their balcony. I realized my fence was not just wood and screws, it was a boundary they could not casually cross with their eyes anymore. That was the real problem. I could have thrown the note away. Instead, I slid it into a clear plastic sleeve and dropped it into a thin file folder I labeled with the name of the association. It felt ridiculous in that moment, like I was filing evidence for a trial that would never happen, but something told me this community did not let petty grievances die. It archived them in whispers until someone like Ms. D found a way to make them official. Life in the building moved with a strange rhythm. Morning dog walkers shared updates about other residents by describing their pets. Evening joggers slowed near the bulletin board to skim new postings, then carried those snippets back to their units like they were trading cards. The board met once a month in the small community room near the pool, and on those nights, the scent of chlorine drifted through the open door while the same handful of people decided what everyone else's home should look like. The board president, a sharp-eyed man I will call Mr. K, loved numbers and policies. The treasurer, Lena, seemed to care more about keeping the budget afloat than enforcing taste. The real force, though, was the unofficial seat at the table, the voice of whichever neighbor had complained most recently. That is where Miss D always found her way in, even if her name never appeared on the official agenda. I learned early on that the association thrived on certain phrases: property values, visual cohesion, safety concerns. You could dress almost any personal preference in one of those outfits and it suddenly looked respectable. If you did not like a neighbor's car, you called it an eyesore impacting property values. If you were afraid of unfamiliar faces, you framed it as a safety concern. If something simply annoyed you, you warned it threatened visual cohesion. The board listened closely whenever someone used those magic words. My fence did not break any rule, but it upset a pattern. Before I moved in, that corner of the property had been bare. The walkway beside my patio was a perfect view corridor for anyone walking by to glance straight into my sliding glass door. People got used to scanning it, the way you might get used to checking a store window as you pass. The fence turned that window into a wall, and that wall turned mindless observing into an effort. Some people hate being reminded that their curiosity has a limit. I responded the only way that gave me any sense of control: I documented. I wrote down dates when I found notes. I saved board emails that shifted from general policy to oddly specific warnings about structures projecting a hostile tone. I even started keeping a log of times I saw cell phones pointed in my direction from upper walkways and balconies. It felt obsessive, but it also felt necessary. If the board ever tried to turn this into something official, I wanted to be ready. At night, when the building grew quiet and the only audible sound was the distant hum of traffic beyond the gate, I would flip through my growing evidence. The notes, the agenda pages, the printed CCR section 7.2 with my highlight pen marks, all of it told a different story than the one people were circulating. On paper, I was a homeowner who followed the rules, sought approval, and stayed within the boundaries. In whispers, I was a hostile newcomer who had changed the entire feel of the property. That gap between paperwork and perception was where the real war was forming. I did not yet have the idea of the anonymous photo wall. That would come later, after enough lines were crossed and enough lies were dressed up as concern. For now, all I had was a folder and a fence, a thin barrier against both wandering eyes and wandering narratives. I could feel the building tightening around me, like it was preparing to pick a side, but no one had said the quiet part out loud yet. Someone wanted me to undo my boundary so they could feel comfortable again. The first hint of how far they were willing to go came in the form of a subtle change to the community's communication style. A new memo appeared on the bulletin board, printed on the association letterhead. It talked about maintaining a welcoming atmosphere and reminded residents that all changes visible from common areas must reflect the community's open and friendly character. The language sounded polished, but the meaning was blunt. Structures that looked like walls were out of step with the building's values. I knew that memo was about me because nothing else had changed in the complex. No one had built an extension, no one had painted a garage door a wild color. The only new element visible from the walkway was my fence. I took a picture of the memo, printed it at home, and added it to my file. The evidence pile was starting to look less like paranoia and more like a documented pattern of pressure. What I did not expect was how quickly the narrative of hostile newcomers would catch fire. People I had barely met started treating me like an unwelcome guest in a house I had bought into like everyone else. It was in small things, the way someone reached past me to grab a package without acknowledging my presence, or how a neighbor stepped aside with exaggerated care when we crossed paths near the gate, as if I were the one invading their space. At some point, boundaries had been flipped. My fence was a boundary meant to keep my patio private. Yet the people upset about it were the ones imposing social walls, cutting me off in subtle ways while claiming I was the one who did not want connection. It was a quiet, passive war, but it was a war all the same. And as the tension rose, the stakes did too. The board had not issued any formal violation yet, but the language in their communications grew sharper, and the whispers about taking action grew louder behind closed doors. The silent question hanging over everything was simple: would they try to force me to take the fence down, or would I bend first to keep the peace? I did not have an answer yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was not the only one being watched. They were all leaving fingerprints on the story, and I was learning exactly how to collect them. The more I watched them, the more obvious it became that I was not the only one collecting things. They collected stories. I collected proof. Their stories drifted from stairwell to balcony to parking lot, getting polished like gossip stones. My proof lived in a simple paper folder in a drawer by the front door, its edges getting thicker every week. I started marking dates in the margins. March 4th, first anonymous note. March 18th, bulletin memo about welcoming atmosphere. March 29th, board agenda mentioning impacts on upper unit residents' experience. All of it tied back to one simple choice: I wanted a fence around my tiny rectangle of concrete more than I wanted the illusion of being everyone's favorite new neighbor. Chapter 12:00. Things shifted from annoying to strategic when a new kind of paper started showing up: printed photos. The first one lay curled on my doormat one windy afternoon, the glossy side facing up. It was a low-angle shot of my fence taken at dusk, the shadows making the panels look taller than they really were. In the corner, you could see the edge of an upstairs railing. I stared at it for a long second, then flipped it over. Nothing written on the back. No note, no accusation, just the image, as if the photo itself was meant to be the message. I slid it into my folder without even thinking. A few days later, another appeared, this one taken in harsh midday light, where the fence cast a sharp rectangle on the concrete and made the walkway look a little narrower. This time, the edge of a shoe and a bit of balcony wall showed in the upper corner. The angles told me everything. Whoever was taking these photos lived above me. Whoever lived above me liked to talk at board meetings and send long, emotionally charged emails. I did not write Ms. D's name on the folder, but I might as well have. The upstairs unit and my fence had officially locked into a quiet standoff. The board's tone followed closely behind. An email went out to all residents in early April with the subject line Community Harmony Reminder. It reminded everyone that changes to visible structures should maintain a sense of openness and neighborliness, and that residents who felt boxed in by others' modifications were encouraged to share their experience with the committee. It did not mention fences, unit numbers, or my name. It did not have to. When the board posted the agenda for the April meeting, I made a point of checking it the same day. Under new business, there it was, discussion item 4, labeled resident feedback on ground level privacy additions, plus a parenthetical referencing CCR section 4.3, the section usually used for noise and nuisance complaints. I printed the agenda, highlighted that line, and added it to my folder. One of my evidence props was no longer just some vague memo. It was a clear agenda excerpt tying my fence to a rule meant for actual nuisances. At the meeting, I sat in the same chair along the wall as before, my back to the cool cinder block, a thin trembling hum from the soda machine in the corner filling any pause. The association room lighting made everyone look a little washed out, but the expressions were sharp enough. As they reached item 4, I could feel my heartbeat sync with the slow turning of pages. They did not call me out directly. Instead, Mr. K spoke about how certain recent additions created a perception of division. Someone in the small audience, without identifying themselves, mentioned feeling loomed over by solid barriers when walking by. Another board member referenced residents who had spoken privately about a shift in the emotional feel of the corridor. None of this was official testimony. All of it was fuel. Lena, the treasurer, repeated that the fence had been approved under CCR Section 7.2. She noted that revoking approval would likely require legal consultation and a formal violation process, which would cost money and time. Her language was calm, but I could tell she was trying to steer them away from something bigger. The conversation ended with a non-decision. The board would continue monitoring feedback and evaluate whether any follow-up notices were appropriate. That phrase followed me home like a shadow. Appropriate follow-up notices. They did not know it yet, but the next notice they sent about my unit would become part of a chain I could trace, page by page, straight back to their own rules. The first semi-official letter came in early May. It was titled Courtesy Reminder and printed on association letterhead, with a line at the bottom referencing CCR Section 4.3 even though my fence made no sound and produced no smell. The letter suggested that my structure, while technically compliant by dimensions, might be creating a perception of hostility and discouraging community interaction. It asked me to consider lowering the height or adjusting the design for the sake of neighborly harmony. I held that courtesy reminder in my hands for several minutes, feeling the weight of each sentence. It never said I had violated anything. It never gave me a deadline. Instead, it leaned on guilt. By protecting my own space, I was making other people feel trapped. I slid it into a clear sleeve, wrote May 12, 2027 at the top as if it were a case exhibit, and told myself that if they ever tried to make this official, I would have a timestamp for when the pressure campaign moved from whispers to paperwork. I did not change the fence. I did not respond to the letter. Instead, I kept watering my plants, kept sitting outside with my coffee in the early mornings, kept treating the patio as the one place in this gated enclave that truly belonged to me. Each time I stepped out there, though, I could feel eyes calculating what my refusal meant. That was when the escalation stopped pretending to be polite. The gossip shifted from talking about my fence to talking about me. Suddenly, I was the reason some residents felt uncomfortable walking by. I was the one supposedly glaring through the slats when people passed, even on days I was not home. I heard about these stories not firsthand, but through the strange echo path of communal laundry rooms and shared stairwells. Someone told a friend of a friend that they felt unwelcome in my corner of the building now. Another resident suggested to the board that new move-ins should be screened more thoroughly for fit with the community's open culture. It was the kind of Karen neighbor drama you usually hear about in passing videos, but this time the script was playing out right under the humming fluorescent lights of my own hallway. The board latched onto a new angle. Instead of attacking the fence design directly, they started hinting at a pattern of behavioral concerns. An email in late May referenced general reports of cold or hostile responses from certain residents when approached about common area interactions. It asked everyone to remember that signing the covenants meant agreeing to more than just property standards, it meant committing to community spirit. My name was still not there, but my shadow was. Every time I stepped out to grab my mail, I felt the air tighten. People whispered on the landing, then went quiet when my key slid into the metal box. One neighbor glanced at me, then quickly at the memo pinned to the corkboard behind me, as if both shared a secret. The turning point came when money entered the conversation. It was no longer just about whether my fence looked too solid or my personality felt too quiet. The board started openly discussing potential fines for structures deemed to have negative psychological impact on shared spaces, and the numbers tossed around during the June pre-meeting chatter made my stomach drop. Suddenly, my small act of drawing a boundary carried the threat of hundreds, maybe thousands, in penalties and modification costs. I found out about the money angle by accident. On the first week of June, I arrived home just as the board members were leaving a walkthrough. They stood under the shade of a jacaranda tree near the parking lot, clipboards in hand, comparing notes. I kept my distance, but the breeze carried snippets, phrases like fine schedule, repeat offenses, and hearing if non-compliant. The kind of language that turned quiet pressure into something with actual teeth. That same day, a new document appeared in my mailbox, not under my door. This one had a bolder title, Warning of Potential Violation Review. It cited both CCR Section 7.2 and Section 4.3, twisting the privacy structure rule and the nuisance clause together like they were threads in the same rope. The letter claimed that multiple residents had expressed feeling unsafe and emotionally distressed by my fence and the closed-off atmosphere associated with my unit. Near the bottom, it named a date, June 7, 2027. If no good faith efforts were made to adjust or remove the fence by then, the board reserved the right to consider a formal violation hearing and apply fines in accordance with the published schedule. It was the first time I saw an implied dollar sign attached to their discomfort. The letter did not list an exact amount, but the fine schedule posted online, something I had already downloaded months ago, showed escalating charges that could easily reach $1,200 if they decided to stretch the issue over multiple months. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me, the afternoon light cutting a clean bar across the paper. This was no longer just a petty campaign of side-eye and anonymous notes. This was a structured attempt to make me pay, literally, for refusing to be as open as they wanted me to be. I added the warning to my folder, along with a printout of the fine schedule, highlighting the line that matched their timeline. What they did not realize was that the exact date they chose, June 7, 2027, would become the backbone of my response. If they wanted to draw a line on the calendar, fine. I was more than ready to mark it too. The days leading up to June 7 were heavy with small, tense moments. I noticed more phones angled toward my patio from upper walkways. Once, I stepped out just in time to see an upstairs silhouette yank their arms back, the faint glint of a phone screen vanishing behind a sliding door. Another time, I found a cluster of fresh photos taped messily to the inside of the dumpster enclosure, all featuring my fence from a dozen unflattering angles. I peeled those photos down carefully, smoothed their corners, and added them to my growing collection. My folder was no longer just a stack of paper. It was starting to look like a primitive dossier of who this community really was when they thought no one was keeping score. By the time June 7, 2027 arrived, I was no longer dealing with a simple design complaint. My approved fence had been framed as a psychological threat, my quietness recast as hostility, and my refusal to bow as grounds for potential fines. The board had a date circled in red on their calendar, backed by anonymous photos and whispered complaints. I had a folder full of their letters, agendas, memos, and those same photos, all ready to be turned back on them. That was the day I stopped thinking like a resident under scrutiny and started thinking like an archivist of their behavior. If they were determined to control the narrative about who I was, I would show them exactly what their version of harmony looked like when you pinned it up in bright hallway light. The morning of June 7 came in hot and still. The sun hit the white stucco walls so hard that the air shimmered above the parking lot, and the gate's metal bars burned warm to the touch. I walked out to my fence the way I always did, running my hand along the top rail, feeling the familiar grain of the wood through the paint. Nothing about the structure had changed. Everything about the situation had. I did nothing the board would recognize as a good faith effort to change my fence. I did not lower it or repaint it. I did not add a faux-friendly cutout or a decorative trellis to soften the lines. My only effort was internal. I spent that day at my dining table with my evidence folder spread out around me, organizing, dating, and grouping everything into themes. Notes in one stack. Photos in another. Official communications in a third. What emerged as I laid everything out was a disturbing kind of symmetry. For every polite, sanitized line in the board's letters, there was a raw, spiteful counterpart in the anonymous notes. For every vague agenda item about resident feedback, there was a glossy photo taken from above without my knowledge. They had crafted a story about me, but every step of that story left a paper trail. June 7, 2027 did not end with a knock on my door, a formal hearing notice, or a surprise fine. It ended in silence, outside, at least. Inside my unit, something very different had begun. That date became the line in my mind between reacting and retaliating, between hoping they would back off and deciding to hold up a mirror. I realized that the same cameras and complaints being used to paint me as hostile could be rearranged into a gallery showing exactly how this community treated anyone who dared to draw a boundary. If they were willing to put a price tag on my fence, I was willing to put their behavior on display, right where every neighbor would have to decide whether they stood with the story they had been told or with the evidence taped in front of them. The idea of the anonymous photo wall did not arrive all at once. It started as a thought when I held two images side by side, one glossy shot of my fence taken from an upstairs balcony, and one copy of the courtesy reminder that twisted the word nuisance to fit my existence. I wondered what would happen if the building saw those items the way I saw them, in pairs, in context, with dates attached. I imagined the hallway near the mailroom, that narrow stretch of wall where people instinctively slow down to shuffle envelopes or balance packages. The lighting there was unforgiving, buzzing overhead and washing everything in a flat neutral tone. It was the perfect place, I realized, for a display that claimed no author, no commentary, just the raw artifacts of what this association called harmony. Before I could act on that vision, though, I needed to be precise. Revenge without clarity is just noise. Revenge with records is something else. I went back through my stack and added small notes in pencil on the backs of each page, dates, locations, connections. This print came from the dumpster area. This note appeared after the April meeting. This agenda excerpt introduced the misuse of CCR Section 4.3. I also added one more evidence prop to the mix, a printed screenshot of a section from the association's own communication policy, the part that warned against harassment and defamation within resident interactions. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The same group that wagged its finger about respectful conduct had allowed rumors about hostile newcomers to drift unchecked through every stairwell. The more I assembled, the clearer the plan became. I would not write a single accusatory sentence. I would not name anyone directly. Instead, I would let their words, their photos, and their official letters stand side by side. The hallway would become a silent jury, and everyone in the building would walk through it whether they wanted to or not. I sketched a rough layout in a notebook, 3 columns on a standard corkboard-sized space. Left column for anonymous notes, center for photos, right column for official communications. The dates would run downward, like a timeline of how a simple, approved fence became a symbol of some invented menace. I planned to cover the unit numbers and identifying details on any document that did not need them, leaving only the content that revealed attitudes and decisions. As I drew the layout, the air in my unit felt different. It was still and cool, but there was an undercurrent of energy, like static before a storm. For months, I had been the subject of a story I did not write. Now, at last, I had something else, a way to turn their own documentation into a quiet, undeniable narrative. One they could not dismiss as gossip, because it was built from the very paperwork they worshipped. The retaliation phase had officially begun in my mind, even if, out in the hallway, everything still looked the same. The board thought June 7, 2027 was a deadline for me to act on their terms. They had no idea it had become the starting point for something much more precise, and much harder to control. End of Module 2. In the days after June 7, I moved like nothing had changed, but inside my head, the blueprint was complete. Every time I passed that blank stretch of hallway by the mailboxes, I could see the future shape of it, rows of papers, corners pinned, edges overlapping, a collage of the building's own behavior staring back at itself. I waited. Not out of fear but out of strategy. The warning letter had given them a deadline they expected me to respect. I wanted them lulled by the silence when that date passed without any obvious fight. The board loved predictability. They were not ready for an answered war that did not sound like shouting, only the soft crackle of tape on paper. I chose a quiet weeknight for the actual setup, when the air in the corridors felt heavy and still and most people were inside with the hum of their televisions and the faint clink of dishes drifting through their doors. I stacked my folder on the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and began selecting pages. The first row was made of notes, the hostile but polite reminders about openness, the anonymous complaints about emotional aggression, the scribbled papers left at my door. The second row was the photos, fence angles taken from above, dumpster shots, zoomed-in corners of my patio captured like they were evidence of a crime. The third row was the official board material, the courtesy reminder dated May 12, 2027, the warning of potential violation review referencing June 7, 2027, and the agenda excerpt that misused CCR Section 4.3 to frame my fence as a nuisance. I blacked out unit numbers and names wherever they were not necessary. I was not interested in targeting a person by name, I wanted the pattern visible, not the individual signatures. I labeled nothing. No title, no accusations, no dramatic heading. Just dates handwritten neatly in one corner of each page, running top to bottom, like a timeline of how a boundary had become a rumor, then a threat. Carrying the stack to the hallway felt like walking with a mirror. The air smelled faintly like dust and old paper, and the fluorescent tube above the mailboxes flickered once before settling into a steady hum. I pinned the first page at eye level. Then another. And another. The sound of thumbtacks pushing into cork was soft but distinct, each one a small puncture in the facade of harmony they loved to advertise. When I finished, the wall looked like a case board without strings. No arrows, no captions, just their own words and images, finally arranged where they belonged, in public view. I stepped back, adjusted one crooked corner, and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. The war they had been fighting with whispers now had a visible front line. The first reactions came early the next morning. I intentionally delayed checking my mail, letting the early risers discover the wall without me hovering nearby. The building had its rhythms, dog owners at dawn, commuters by 7, the retired residents who liked to wander out mid-morning just to see who had left packages on the table. By the time I wandered down, coffee mug in hand, a small cluster of people already stood in front of the display. No one spoke, but their body language said enough. Arms folded. Heads tilted. One person leaned in so close to a photo that the tip of their nose almost brushed the paper. Another stepped back, scanning the entire collection like they were trying to spot the moment when the story stopped looking like concern and started looking like obsession. I slipped into the edge of the group, pretending to study my mail key while watching out of the corner of my eye. A woman from the opposite wing, who had never once commented on my fence, traced the lines of the May 12th courtesy reminder with her gaze, then glanced up at a photo of the same fence shot from an upper balcony at night. Side by side, they were impossible to ignore, a polite letter about community harmony and a shadowy, unauthorized picture taken of a neighbor's home. To my surprise, no one tore anything down. Not at first. The wall had no signature, no confession of ownership. For all anyone knew, the board had posted it as part of some new transparency push. That uncertainty bought the display time, and time gave it power. People went back to their units carrying the images in their minds, not filtered through someone else's retelling but seen with their own eyes. It did not take long, though, for the person who recognized themselves most clearly in those documents to act. Before noon, a heavy envelope thudded into my mailbox, stamped with certified mail markings and addressed in sharp, familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter that shifted the stakes from gossip and fines to something colder, accusations of defamation and a demand that I pay $1,200 or remove the hallway display immediately to avoid further legal escalation. That was the moment the quiet war officially crossed into the threat of legal consequence. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table, the air conditioning humming softly above me. The claim was written as if it came from a position of great seriousness. It said the photos and notes on the wall created a false narrative that harmed the reputation of an upstairs resident and portrayed them as a harasser. It did not use Ms. D's name, but the way it described the emotional distress of being watched and judged made it clear who had written it. The letter claimed damages, hinted at consulting an attorney, and attached a printed summary of the fine schedule as if that proved I was the one misusing association mechanisms. It demanded $1,200, payable within a short window, as compensation for the embarrassment and anxiety supposedly caused by the display. I felt a brief spike of adrenaline, a prickle at the back of my neck. The number they had been waving over my head through the association, $1,200, had come home in a different costume, now framed as private reparation instead of formal fines. It was petty and overreaching, but it was also exactly the kind of move someone makes when they are more afraid of the truth being seen than any rule technically being broken. I did not crumble. I did not tear down the wall. Instead, I added the letter to my collection, sliding it into a sleeve at the front of the folder. It was, in many ways, the clearest snapshot yet, a direct attempt to financially punish me for presenting their own documentation with no commentary. I did not respond immediately. I wanted to be deliberate. I took one evening to breathe, to walk out onto my patio, to touch the top of the fence that had started this entire spiral. The sky was streaked with late light, and the sound of distant lawn tools buzzed somewhere outside the gate. For the first time in months, I did not feel like the one under a microscope. The wall in the hallway had shifted the focus. The threat letter was proof of that. The next day, I drafted my reply. I kept it short. I acknowledged receipt of the letter. I clarified that every item on the hallway wall was an unaltered, anonymized reproduction of notes, photos, and official communications already circulated within the community. I noted that no names or unit numbers were posted and that the display was a personal compilation of my experience, not a statement issued in the name of the association. Then I sent a separate message to the board, copying in the association's generic contact email. In that message, I attached scans of everything: the anonymous notes, the photos, the courtesy reminder from May 12, the warning of potential violation review with the June 7, 2027 date, and the newly received demand for $1,200. I also attached a screenshot of the association's own communication policy about harassment and defamation. I asked a simple question: whether compiling previously circulated materials into a single, anonymized display violated any written rule. I did not threaten them. I did not hint at lawyers. I just asked, in writing, for clarity. In a place that loved rules, clarity could be more dangerous than confrontation. The board's reaction came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, a notice went up for a special community discussion to address recent concerns about hallway postings, interpersonal disputes, and the misuse of association processes. The meeting would be open to all residents. It would take place in the same community room by the pool, under the same humming lights and the faint smell of chlorine. Walking into that meeting felt like stepping onto a stage I had accidentally built. The room was fuller than usual. People who never attended budget reviews now sat in folding chairs, arms crossed or notebooks on their laps. Some had printed copies of the hallway display photos on their phones, zooming in and whispering in low tones. The board members looked tense. Mr. K's normally slick composure had tiny cracks around the edges. Lena held a stack of papers a little too tightly, the corners bending. Ms. D sat, not at the table, but not far from it, in one of the front row seats, her jaw set in a line that made her look carved from stone. The meeting began with a familiar speech about harmony and respect. Then they shifted into the first agenda item: hallway postings. They acknowledged that a display had been put up near the mailroom containing copies of notes, photos, and association communications. They stated that some residents had found it upsetting and felt personally targeted. I raised my hand. When they gave me the floor, I spoke in the same calm tone I had used in my email. I explained that every item on that wall existed because someone, anonymous or official, had chosen to put it into circulation. The notes had been left at my door. The photos had been taped to dumpsters or dropped outside my unit. The letters had been mailed under the association's own letterhead. I explained that my sole addition had been to gather them, remove names and unit numbers, and present them as a timeline of what it looks like when a resident follows CCR 7.2 and still gets treated like a problem for wanting privacy. I pointed out that the hallway display did not accuse anyone directly. It simply showed patterns. I did not mention the term HOA revenge story out loud, but I could feel it hanging in the air, the idea that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not shouting or property damage but a mirror held so close that people finally see what they have turned into. Then, without raising my voice, I mentioned the $1,200 threat letter. I stated, factually, that after the display went up, I received a demand for payment alleging defamation and emotional harm. I noted that the letter cited no false statements I had made, only the emotional impact of seeing existing materials placed in one location. I asked, again, whether the association considered it appropriate for residents to weaponize legal terms to intimidate others into erasing their own experiences. A ripple moved through the room. People turned their heads, glancing at one another, putting pieces together. Some had seen the hallway wall. Others had only heard about it. Many had, at some point, received or witnessed the same style of anonymous note now pinned up in plain view. It was harder to dismiss as an isolated incident when the pattern stood 3 columns wide on a corkboard. Lena spoke up. For the first time, her voice carried more weight than Mr. K's. She acknowledged that the fence had been approved under CCR 7.2 and that no subsequent rule change had occurred. She admitted that referencing CCR Section 4.3, a nuisance clause, in relation to a silent, static structure had been a stretch, one driven by complaints rather than by clear violations. She also reminded everyone that the communication policy prohibited harassment and intimidation, including threats framed as legal action without clear grounds. She did not name Ms. D, but her eyes briefly flicked toward the front row when she mentioned it. Ms. D requested to speak as a concerned resident. She talked about feelings, about how the fence and the wall made her uncomfortable, about how the building had once felt open and now felt divided. She described the hallway display as an attack, a public shaming, a portrayal of her as a villain in some personal narrative. I did not interrupt. I did not roll my eyes or shake my head. I let her pour out every word, because every word she used circled back to the same point. She believed her comfort was the standard against which all boundaries should be measured. When she finished, Lena calmly responded that discomfort alone was not a violation. She said that while the association did not want common areas turned into personal galleries, they also could not punish a resident for compiling existing materials that revealed a pattern of targeted behavior. Any action taken, she said, had to be consistent with written rules and applied fairly. The board went into a brief closed discussion, sending everyone out into the pool patio area while they talked. The evening air outside was warm, smelling faintly of chlorine and flowering shrubs. People gathered in small clusters, whispering, glancing at me with something that was no longer quite suspicion. In some faces, I saw unease. In others, a kind of reluctant respect. When they called us back in, the decision came down like the quiet end of a storm. The board announced that my fence remained fully approved and in compliance with CCR 7.2. No fines would be pursued. The misuse of CCR Section 4.3 in relation to my case had been noted, and future nuisance references would require clearer criteria. The hallway display, while unorthodox, did not violate any current written rules so long as identifying information remained redacted and materials were not fabricated. Going forward, the association would be drafting clearer guidelines on hallway postings to avoid turning common spaces into battlegrounds. They asked me, as a gesture toward cooling tensions, whether I would consider removing the wall once those new guidelines were in place and once a written acknowledgement was circulated affirming my fence's compliance and discouraging anonymous complaints. I agreed. Not because I felt guilty, but because the point of the wall was never to live there forever. It was to make visible what had been hidden. Now, the pattern was out, documented in board minutes and recognized by the very people who had tried to twist rules against me. The display had done its job. In the weeks that followed, the building's atmosphere changed in subtle but undeniable ways. The anonymous notes stopped. The sideways glances softened into cautious nods. People still talked, of course, this place ran on chatter, but the stories sounded different now. Where my name had once been floated as an example of hostility, it now came up as a cautionary tale about what happens when you push someone who keeps receipts. The board circulated a formal letter to all residents. It confirmed that ground-level privacy structures approved under CCR 7.2 were valid, that the association would no longer entertain complaints based solely on subjective discomfort, and that any concerns about harassment should go through proper channels instead of anonymous notes or personal threats. Reading that letter felt like standing behind my fence on a breezy evening, the air finally moving freely without pushing against me. As promised, after the letter went out and the new hallway posting guidelines were drafted, focused on size, duration, and anonymity, not silence, I took the display down. Page by page, I removed the thumbtacks, slid the papers back into clear sleeves, and returned them to my folder. The wall returned to its usual blankness. The building, however, had changed. Ms. D grew quieter. For a while, she stuck to soft complaints exchanged in the parking lot, but they lacked their former edge. People had seen too much. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared in the upstairs window, small and tentative at first, then replaced by a larger one planted in the grass just outside our wing. When her unit finally emptied and the balcony went dark, the building did not erupt into cheers. It just exhaled. I kept the fence, of course. It stood exactly as it always had, soft gray under the sun, a simple boundary around my small patio. I sat out there on evenings, listening to the distant buzz of traffic and the occasional clang of the gate. What they had not counted on was that their own words and actions would make even better symbols into a symbol of some imagined hostility. They had tried to make me pay $1,200 for daring to make my boundary visible. Instead, they ended up paying in reputation, in lost influence, and, eventually, in a vacancy sign that reminded everyone power here was not as absolute as gossip made it seem. The war in our gated enclave had never been loud. It had been fought in notes and sideways glances, in misused CCR references and subtle shaming. But in the end, it was settled by something simple, evidence laid out where everyone could see it, and the quiet refusal to back down when the bill for someone else's comfort landed in my mailbox. Tell me your own fence gossip HOA horror in one line.